Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning into this story. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. I remember boarding that flight like it was a dream come to life, just not the kind of dream you'd ever want to have. The terminal was unusually quiet, even for a late-night departure. I'd scored a seat in first class for the first time in my life, thanks to an upgrade I never expected. At the time, I considered it good luck. Little did I know the universe had decided I'd need every advantage I could get. Walking down the jet bridge, I felt that familiar rush of excitement mixed with nervous energy. I've always loved flying, though I know plenty of people fear it. Something about the possibility of adventure enthralls me. Yet that night, an odd hush settled over the airport. It was as though the entire terminal was holding its breath. When I reached my seat, 3A, I slipped off my coat and carefully placed it in the overhead bin. The plush recliner was already waiting, complete with a blanket and a pillow embroidered with the airline's logo. A flight attendant offered me a small glass of sparkling water, her polite smile flashing in the muted cabin light. It felt so luxurious. I was ready to relax, watch a movie, and maybe drift off as we soared across the ocean. Just before turning off my phone for departure, I noticed a notification. Emergency alert. Zombie outbreak detected. The text on my screen glowed with an intensity that almost made me recoil. I stared at the words for a moment, half expecting a friend to pop out from behind a seat, laughing at a practical joke. My head started spinning. An outbreak? Zombie? It sounded like the premise for a late-night horror film. I glanced around, but nobody else seemed alarmed. Half the passengers in first class were already wearing noise-cancelling headphones or scrolling absent-mindedly on their phones. The flight attendant was still at the front of the cabin, checking seatbelts and overhead storage. My heart beat faster, yet I told myself it was some bizarre glitch in the emergency alert system. Maybe it was a hack or a false alarm. I switched my phone to airplane mode, reassuring myself that once we landed, I'd discover it had been some elaborate hoax. We pushed back from the gate, and the cabin lights dimmed for takeoff. Engines roared, and my seat trembled with the steady vibration. Despite my odd sense of unease, I felt that old, familiar thrill as the plane picked up speed along the runway. In seconds, we were airborne, climbing into a starless sky. About half an hour after takeoff, I relaxed into my seat, sipping a warm beverage. The cabin lights had softened to a gentle glow, encouraging drowsy travelers to sleep. I flicked through the in-flight entertainment screen, searching for a film to distract me from the weird alert I'd seen earlier. Suddenly, the overhead speakers crackled, interrupting the quiet hum of conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen," began a calm but strained voice. "This is your captain speaking. We've received a message from ground control indicating an unusual situation in several major cities. Please remain in your seats and follow crew instructions." Everyone around me straightened up. Curious murmurs spread through the first-class cabin. A few folks unfastened their seatbelts to glance towards the cockpit area, but a flight attendant quickly gestured for them to remain seated. I noticed the attendant's face had lost its earlier composure. She looked down at her hands as though trying to keep them from trembling. My own pulse quickened. An unusual situation was far too vague an announcement to soothe my nerves. The pilot's voice had been calm, but there was something in the way he spoke, an undercurrent of tension, like a whispered alarm hidden beneath his measured tone. I checked my phone again, though it showed no signal. Flight mode was still on, and there'd be no new alerts until we reconnected to the ground. I tried to focus on my screen, but every film choice seemed trivial next to the possibility of real danger, especially with that bizarre message I'd read before takeoff. Over the next hour, the flight attendants served beverages and light snacks, but the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. From my seat, I could see the forward galley. 2 flight attendants stood there, huddled close, speaking in hushed voices. One shook her head as if dismissing what the other was saying. Then I saw a third flight attendant approach, offering a quick, worried update. though her words were too soft to catch. Yet the look on her face said it all. Something was terribly wrong. When she returned to the aisle, she attempted a reassuring smile for the passengers, but it flickered and vanished quickly. I realized every person in that cabin was picking up on the strange vibe. A few asked questions out loud. Is everything okay? Should we be worried? Are we making an emergency landing somewhere? No clear answers came. The flight attendants offered the standard line. We're just experiencing a slight irregularity in communication with the ground. Except no one was buying it. Not fully. Despite my unease, I reasoned that if it was serious, the captain or the first officer would have made an announcement urging us to land right away. Right? About 2 hours into the flight, the seatback entertainment system flickered. Several screens, including mine, briefly went black. Then, instead of the usual movie listings, a news channel appeared. The video feed was scrambled with only bits of speech coming through. Words like state of emergency, continue to shelter, and riots caught my attention. I tapped the screen to switch it off or change the channel, but the controls were unresponsive. As I stared, text scrolled across the bottom of the screen in shaky letters. Emergency alert. Seek immediate shelter. Then the screen cut to static and went dark again, as if it had lost its source feed entirely. The overhead lighting flickered. A short beep sounded through the cabin, and the flight attendants hurried up and down the aisle, instructing everyone to remain calm. My heart thumped so loudly I could feel it in my throat. This was no joke. Something big was happening on the ground, and we were trapped in the sky. Yet, ironically, being on a plane had once seemed like the safest place, far from any chaos happening on the streets below. I was nearly dozing off in a restless sort of way when a commotion broke out farther down the aisle, behind the velvet curtain that separated first class from economy. The sound was low at first, like a moan or a muffled shout. Then came the clatter of a serving cart toppling over. A flight attendant rushed past, nearly tripping, and vanished behind the curtain. Instinctively, I unfastened my seatbelt and stood up, trying to see what was happening. A few other passengers in first class did the same. One by one, we inched toward the partition. The flight attendants who remained in the forward galley gave us stern looks, urging us to return to our seats, but curiosity and concern propelled us forward. Before I could cross into the economy cabin, however, I heard a series of panicked shrieks. It sounded like multiple people yelling at once. Something heavy crashed into the bulkhead, and the curtain swayed ominously. Another flight attendant scrambled forward, pushing a rolling suitcase in an attempt to barricade the curtain. Her eyes were wide with alarm. "What's going on?" demanded a man in 2C. He was tall, with neatly combed hair and an expensive watch. He looked more furious than afraid, as if outraged that something was disturbing his flight. The flight attendant's voice trembled as she spoke. There's a situation in the aft cabin. Please, everyone, stay calm and remain up here. We need to keep this area secure." She struggled to push the suitcase into place, but it was obvious that she felt severely out of her depth. A woman near me asked, "Is it related to that emergency alert?" The flight attendant did not answer. She merely mouthed the word, "Please," her tone a silent plea for cooperation. Then she moved aside and spoke into a small communication device clipped to her uniform. We heard the intercom chime again, but this time the pilot's voice sounded tense. "Folks, this is your captain. We have received incomplete information from ground control regarding a major emergency across multiple locations. Our top priority is to ensure the safety of everyone on board. Please follow the directions of our cabin crew and remain seated unless instructed otherwise. We are exploring landing options as soon as possible." A wave of nervous chatter filled first class. Some wanted more details. Others simply wanted to land immediately, no matter where. I heard someone mention turning back to our departure airport, while another suggested continuing to our destination if it was safer. There were no easy answers. The flight attendant in front tried to field questions, but every reply was vague. I kept glancing at that curtain to economy class, half expecting someone, or something to burst through. My imagination ran wild with possibilities. I'd always dismissed zombie outbreak stories as silly. Yet the alert I'd seen, and the hints of conflict behind that curtain made me wonder if something far stranger than a typical emergency was unfolding. I tried to swallow, but my mouth felt dry. I couldn't stand not knowing. Carefully, I inched closer to the curtain, waiting for the crew to be distracted by the barrage of questions from the other passengers. A faint corridor of darkness separated first class from the dimly lit economy cabin. Holding my breath, I pulled the corner of the curtain aside just enough to peer through. What I saw set my nerves on edge. Several rows down, the overhead lighting in economy flickered erratically. Most seats were empty, but scattered personal items littered the floor. Pillows, headphones, half-finished meals. One passenger still sat in their seat, leaning at an odd angle as if fast asleep. Another crouched in the aisle, rummaging for something. Then, I noticed two flight attendants in the galley near the back. They seemed to be restraining a person. The individual flailed with unnatural strength, arms jerking as if in a wild panic. The flight attendants tried to secure them, but the thrashing figure broke free and stumbled down the aisle, vanishing from my line of sight. The flight attendants gave chase, their frantic footsteps echoing like thunder in the cramped space. Goosebumps pricked my skin. Whatever was happening back there wasn't just a simple passenger disturbance. Even from a distance, the movements of that person, erratic, unsteady, and yet disturbingly vigorous, hinted at something deeply wrong. I let the curtain fall and backed away, heart hammering. I caught the eye of the flight attendant near me, who had seen me peeking. She gave a warning shake of her head, then whispered, "It's not safe there." Returning to my seat, I tried to collect my thoughts. A small group of passengers in first class had formed a huddle, discussing possible plans. Some believed the threat was contained to the back of the plane. Others insisted we should demand the cockpit land the aircraft immediately. A few frantically checked their laptops or tablets, hoping to find internet access, only to realize the in-flight Wi-Fi was no longer functioning. An older woman in 4B seemed especially anxious, gripping the armrest until her knuckles turned pale. She whispered to me, "I just want to get home. Did you see anything back there?" I didn't know how to answer. Describing what I'd seen would only heighten her panic. So I shook my head, offering a comforting lie. It looked like the crew was handling a passenger who got sick. They're doing their best. She exhaled shakily. All these emergency alerts. It must be serious. I nodded, wishing I had something more optimistic to say. An abrupt jolt rattled the plane, as if we'd hit sudden turbulence. Passengers gasped and clutched their armrests. For a moment, the overhead bins rattled. The seatbelt sign dinged, and a red glow filled the cabin. The lights dimmed, flickered back on, then dipped again. The entire aircraft felt awash in dread. In the faint strobe-like lighting, I could see shadows moving behind that curtain. A chorus of sounds drifted forward, shuffling feet, muffled shrieks, and intermittent banging against seatbacks or walls. Yet no one from economy had burst into first class. The flight attendants stationed in front seemed determined to keep that from happening. One of them used leftover first-class meal trays and even a pair of ropes from the service cart to reinforce a barrier at the curtain's edge. Before, I'd felt safe in first class, removed from the typical chaos of the main cabin. Now, that sense of luxury felt meaningless. We were just as trapped as everyone else. The plane lurched again, banking sharply to one side. Through the small window near me, I saw only darkness and faint glimmers of starlight. An unsteady feeling flooded my stomach as the nose of the aircraft dipped, as if we were descending. A ripple of alarm spread through the cabin. Could we be making an emergency landing somewhere? The pilot's voice cracked over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the sudden maneuvers. We've been advised to maintain a holding pattern. Several large airports have instituted lockdown measures. We'll keep you updated." His words provided little clarity. Why the holding pattern? If an outbreak on the ground was serious enough to shut down airports, where would we land? Even if we found a runway, would it be a safe place? My thoughts were tangled, and fear gnawed at me. At this point, the tension in first class was nearly tangible. One passenger, the tall man with the expensive watch, stood up and marched towards the cockpit, presumably to demand answers. A flight attendant blocked him, insisting he return to his seat. His frustration boiled over, and he shouted something about wanting the truth, but the attendant remained firm. Another passenger, a younger man, rummaged in the overhead bin and pulled out a suitcase. I wasn't sure what he hoped to find, but he started checking through compartments and zippers, eventually extracting a small flashlight and some sort of protective face covering. Nobody questioned him. In fact, a few other people followed suit, scouring their carry-ons for anything that might prove useful in an emergency. I found myself reaching for the blanket on my seat. It was a flimsy shield, but my hands were trembling, and covering myself gave a strange sense of comfort. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do if someone from the back cabin made it through. Every so often, a thud or crash from behind the curtain made me flinch. We all tensed, half expecting a surge of panicked passengers to erupt into first class. Suddenly, the overhead screens in first class flickered again. No one had touched them, but a news broadcast popped into view. The image was scrambled and muted, with only scrolling text. It mentioned a wide-scale crisis, advising residents to remain indoors, lock doors, and avoid contact with infected individuals. It specifically said, symptoms include disorientation, unsteady movement, and an insatiable urge to attack others. Those words, attack others, sent a chill down my spine. The text ended with, emergency alert, zombie outbreak, seek immediate shelter. My mouth went dry. I wanted to believe it was a hoax, but after the screams from the back and the pilot's shaky announcements, denial was getting harder to maintain. The screens blinked out again, leaving us with no illusions about the severity of our situation. It happened without warning. A deafening crash resounded, as if a body collided with the barrier at the front of the economy section. The makeshift barricade, suitcases, trays, and ropes gave way. Flight attendants shouted in alarm, and one fell back into the aisle, colliding with a row of seats. A figure stumbled through the gap. Even in the dim light, I could see the vacant look on their face. Their movements were jerky, each step a struggle for balance. The flight attendants rushed to intercept, holding up their arms to keep the person away from everyone else. Several passengers gasped and backed away, some tripping over their own belongings. I stood up, my heart racing, unsure whether to help or run. Before I could act, a second figure appeared behind the first. This one lurched forward, nearly colliding with the seats in the last row of first class. A flight attendant managed to push the second person back, urging them to calm down. The first figure, meanwhile, turned its attention to the older woman in 4B, who was now standing in the aisle, unsure what to do. With surprising speed, the figure moved closer, arms outstretched as if reaching for help, or something far more sinister. I rushed forward on instinct, grabbing the older woman's arm and pulling her behind me. The flight attendant and I both shouted warnings, telling the figure to stop, to back away. They paid no heed, stumbling closer. That same vacant expression etched across their features. A moment later, the figure wavered, as if about to collapse. Then 2 flight attendants tackled them, dragging them toward the curtain. The second figure had retreated somehow, or possibly had fallen back into the economy section during the scuffle. The air was filled with shouts and calls for calm. I helped the older woman back to her seat. She trembled and thanked me, her eyes brimming with tears. A few other passengers began barricading the curtain area again, piling up anything with enough weight to serve as a barrier. The flight attendants, red-faced and breathing hard, managed to secure the first figure behind the curtain, but not before we all witnessed their strange, unfocused gaze and restless movements. For a brief moment, first class was silent except for the panting of passengers catching their breath. Several people sat down, heads in their hands, trying to process what had just happened. I took a long, shaky breath myself, still standing with my back pressed against row 4. Overhead, the lights flickered again, as if the plane itself shuddered in distress. Eventually, one flight attendant spoke through the intercom, her voice wavering. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have managed to secure the forward cabin. We understand this is very frightening. Please stay in your seats. We are in communication with the cockpit to find the safest possible landing option." A few murmurs of relief mixed with uneasy glances. We had witnessed firsthand that something deeply unnatural was happening. Even if we weren't sure how or why it started, the reality of it was no longer in doubt. Time dragged on. The sense of isolation intensified. The economy cabin remained mostly out of sight, sealed off by a shaky barricade. Faint noises still drifted forward, clatters, moans, and an occasional series of thumps. Each time, we collectively froze, waiting to see if anyone or anything would break through again. The pilot made another announcement that the major airports in our vicinity were experiencing lockdowns, and we might need to divert to a smaller airport. Yet, from the frustration evident in his voice, it sounded like nowhere was eager to let a potentially compromised flight land. I tried to catch bits of the flight attendants' conversations. They mentioned something about the situation being worldwide, not confined to a single region. Another whispered about the cockpit's concern. They didn't want to risk bringing infected passengers to an airport if it would spread the outbreak further. Outside, the night stretched on. Inside, the cabin lights dimmed, either due to a power glitch or an intentional choice by the crew. Only a few overhead reading lights and the faint glow from the galley illuminated first class. Shadows loomed, making everything feel more claustrophobic. Passengers began to speak in hushed, urgent tones. Some tried to reassure each other, while others fretted openly. A few rummaged through the galley for anything to use as a defensive tool: water bottles, metal coffee pots, even spare blankets that could be used to restrain someone. My mind reeled. I recalled the message about zombie outbreak, and I kept hoping we were misunderstanding something. But the memory of that figure's glazed eyes and erratic movements played over and over in my head. The hush between each odd sound from economy was suffocating. Every nerve in my body was on high alert. At some point, I decided to check the window again, hoping that seeing the sky might ground me in reality. I raised the window shade and leaned closer, but I only saw endless darkness. We were thousands of feet above the earth, suspended in a crisis we couldn't escape. It occurred to me that we were floating above an entire world experiencing turmoil. What were the odds that anywhere on the ground was safe? Suddenly, a reflection flashed across the window. I jerked back, startled, only to realize it was my own face, pale and frightened. I laughed shakily at my own jumpiness, then let the window shade fall, as if blocking out the darkness would also block out my dread. Hours seemed to blur together. The flight crew rationed small snacks and water, encouraging everyone to stay calm. People tried to sleep, but it felt impossible in the suffocating tension. Occasionally, I heard the engine throttle adjusting, possibly as the pilots tested different altitudes or approached new airfields, only to turn away again. Through it all, the barrier to the economy cabin stood firm, for now. The thumps and distant cries eventually subsided, as if the chaos back there had reached a grim standstill. Whether that was good or bad, none of us could decide. At one point, the flight attendant who had tackled the staggering figure ventured back behind the curtain with 2 colleagues. They were gone a long while, leaving us uneasy and anxious. When they returned, their faces told a silent story of shock and despair. A passenger in row 1 pressed for details. "Is it under control back there?" The flight attendant took a few seconds to respond. "We're still assessing," she said carefully. "Many passengers are unwell. It seems some were trying to secure others who were exhibiting alarming behavior. We've done all we can." Her voice trembled on the last sentence. The group of them shared a look that suggested there was little, if any, good news. They asked us to remain calm for just a bit longer. Eventually, the pilot made another announcement. His voice sounded strained with fatigue. "Folks, I'm sorry for the lack of updates. We've tried to reach multiple airports. Most are not permitting us to land due to the large-scale crisis. We will continue searching for a suitable runway. Our fuel situation is being monitored closely. Please remain in your seats." An uneasy hush fell. Fuel. An airplane can't stay in the sky forever. The realization that we might be circling aimlessly, while the chaos on the ground and in the rear cabin grew worse, was terrifying. The tension in first class was a silent storm, swirling in every mind. A few hours later, the plane began a gradual descent. We felt it in our ears as the pressure changed. Whispered questions circulated among the passengers. Were we finally going to land? Had the pilots found somewhere safe? No official announcement came. The flight attendants too seemed on edge, as though they weren't sure of the captain's plan. Some of them buckled into jump seats, instructing us to do the same. The seatbelt sign illuminated again, casting its red glow across the cabin. Slowly, we sank through layers of cloud, as indicated by the slight turbulence that rocked the plane. My stomach twisted in knots. Part of me wanted to be back on solid ground, no matter the risks. Another part dreaded what awaited us, knowing the emergency alerts had warned of widespread danger. Finally, the plane leveled out at a lower altitude. Through the windows on the other side of the aisle, I saw city lights, but they were scattered and faint. It wasn't a bustling urban sprawl. It looked more like the outskirts of a small town, dotted by sporadic illumination. My mind raced. Could we be nearing a less crowded airport? The landing gear deployed with a mechanical whir. The cabin rattled slightly. The pilot's voice, calm but strained, filled the speakers. "Prepare for landing. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." My heart pounded. This was it. We were actually going to land, though no one knew for sure if the ground was any safer. The woman in 4B gripped my hand, and I let her. In an odd way, that small gesture of solidarity helped steady my own trembling. Within minutes, I felt the jolt of the wheels touching asphalt. It wasn't the smoothest landing, but under the circumstances, it felt like a small miracle. The engines roared in reverse, slowing us on a runway that appeared mostly dark, except for a few flickering lights in the distance. A hush fell over first class. Even the flight attendants seemed momentarily relieved that the plane had finally landed. But as we taxied, the gloom beyond the windows gave me no comfort. There were no bustling ground vehicles, no line of airplanes waiting, no bright terminal lights. Everything felt abandoned. Slowly, we rolled to a stop near what appeared to be a deserted terminal building. The pilot came over the intercom again. "We have touched down at a remote airfield. We will evaluate the situation on the ground before disembarking." Peering out the window, I could just make out the silhouettes of buildings against the faint glow of emergency lights. A tall fence lined the perimeter, and beyond that, darkness stretched endlessly. It felt as if we had landed on the edge of nowhere. That's when I noticed movement out there. Shadows, shifting just beyond the reach of the runway lights. Figures, perhaps? People? Or something else? My skin prickled. The tall man in 2C gasped softly. He'd noticed them too. The flight attendants by the door looked tense, as though they might instruct us to stay put. One of them tried to contact ground personnel, but all I heard was static from her handheld radio. The pilot, presumably, was also attempting to reach someone, anyone, in the tower or on an emergency frequency. The door to the cockpit finally swung open, and the captain emerged, face drawn in exhaustion. He conferred quietly with the flight attendants. I caught snippets of their conversation. No response from tower? Not sure if it's safe? Could refuel if we find the right equipment, but how? In normal circumstances, ground crew would hook us up to a jet bridge or a portable staircase. Now, the flight attendants seemed to be discussing whether to open the door at all. The pilot wanted to investigate the terminal, but they had no intel on the situation outside. The possibility of letting infected individuals in, or letting them out, was daunting. Eventually, they cracked open the door, just enough for a single flight attendant to slip out onto the portable staircase that had been manually deployed. The rest of us craned our necks, watching from our seats. She held a flashlight that bobbed up and down in the darkness as she inched away from the aircraft. For a moment she vanished from view. An eerie stillness descended inside the cabin. We listened intently, hoping to hear her return, hoping she would declare it was all a misunderstanding, that rescue teams were on the way. But we heard nothing except the faint hum of the plane's auxiliary power unit. The flight attendant returned a few moments later, climbing aboard with quick, urgent steps. She locked the door behind her, face pale. She conferred with the captain again. In a hushed tone, which carried farther than she intended, she said, "I saw movement out there. It's not safe. There's no one alive in the tower. We need to stay on the plane." The word "alive" left everyone silent. The pilot rubbed his temples, clearly grappling with a no-win scenario. Remain on the plane with limited fuel and unknown threats behind the curtain, or step into a deserted airfield that might be crawling with dangers. At this point, the entire flight had become a standoff with the unknown. The economy cabin was still barricaded, with some unwell passengers or something far worse behind it. On the ground, we had no clear rescue or control tower assistance. It was as if we were suspended in a grim limbo, uncertain where safety lay. The pilot finally cleared his throat, addressing us in a weary tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to remain here on board for the time being. I strongly advise you to stay seated and keep your seat belts fastened. We will continue to evaluate the surroundings. Thank you for your patience." Hours later, nobody had a precise sense of time. We began to see the faintest hint of dawn creeping into the sky. The horizon lightened from black to a muted grey. Tension in the cabin was still high. Some passengers dozed fitfully, while others sat upright, eyes glued to the barricade or the aircraft door. I watched the horizon, hoping the sunlight would chase away the shadows. But as the first rays illuminated the tarmac, a jarring sight emerged. Silhouettes shuffled near the fence line. A few figures actually wandered closer, stumbling in that same disturbing way I'd seen in the back of the plane. We were definitely not alone. No additional instructions came. The flight attendants looked just as tired and fraught as the rest of us. Behind the curtain, the economy cabin was unnervingly quiet, but whether that meant the threat had passed or something worse was lurking, we couldn't say. The pilot stayed in the cockpit, probably trying every communication channel available. By this point, first-class passengers had formed their own quiet alliances, distributing leftover food and water and steeling themselves for what might come next. We glanced at each other with the hollow understanding that no one had any concrete plan. Now, as I sit here, writing down these events in my notebook, my phone long since out of battery, I can only reflect on the strange turn of fate. We're on the ground, yet it feels no safer than being in the sky. The passenger in 2C is crouched by the window, watching those shapes move around outside. A flight attendant stands guard at the economy curtain, listening for any sound. The older woman in 4B has finally closed her eyes, clutching my hand like a lifeline. All we can do is wait. Will help arrive? Will the cockpit find another airport that might allow us to refuel and evacuate? Is there any safe haven left at all? The sun is rising now, revealing the world outside in sharper detail, and none of it looks reassuring. But inside this plane, behind these makeshift barricades and exhausted faces, we cling to the smallest hope that someone, somewhere, has a plan. Because for now, we're alive, suspended on a runway in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a silence that's more terrifying than any scream. And that's where the story ends for me. Or perhaps it's just the beginning of something we never imagined possible. No one knows what comes next. This is the account of my experience, as best as I can record it. If you ever read these words, know that we fought to stay calm when everything crumbled around us. The plane still stands on that remote airstrip. The barricades remain in place. We can only hope that beyond the horizon, there's a chance for rescue, or at least a chance to escape a threat we can't fully comprehend. For now, this is our world, sealed inside a first-class cabin that feels anything but luxurious, perched on silent concrete that might be more dangerous than the sky. If you're reading this from somewhere safe, consider yourself lucky, and if you're not, then you already understand all too well that safety might be nothing more than wishful thinking. Thank you for listening. If this story sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps this channel alive. Until next time, stay vigilant and remember, curiosity can be quite the companion, and sometimes a curse.